be locked out yet, at least the Seahawks, but they pretty much are, you know.
Yeah, let's be fair.
So far, not a lot of noteworthy fantasy performances. I think we all expected Marshawn Lynch to have a slightly bigger day by now. He's just doing okay. He's got, for those, you're probably listening to this Tuesday morning, and we're just starting the third quarter. So,
Yeah, I mean, they're giving him the ball a lot. It's been a big, consistent part of their offense these past 5 weeks. They mentioned earlier that no running back in the NFL has had more touches or more yards over the past 5 weeks than Marshawn Lynch.
all right. And as expected, Steven Jackson is not having a great day because the Seahawks have a really stout run defense there. So it was a pretty good Week 14 for yours truly. I'm currently in this matchup. I started the game down by 10, and I have the Seahawks defense, and he has Brandon Lloyd. So right now we are literally tied. Of course, it doesn't look good because, of course, defenses can lose points and offensive players can gain points. That's typically how it goes.
Well, that being said, with how poorly Sam Bradford and this Rams offense has been playing, I think that your Seahawks defense could be in line for many more points.
Let's hope so. And it looks like I'm knocked out of, I'm in the playoffs in 8 of my 9 leagues, and so far I'm just knocked out of one thanks to bad performances from, there's a sack from a D. Bad performances from DeMarco Murray, Tim Tebow, among others. And great performances out of him and his Eli Manning, Hakeem Nicks combination that killed me last night.
Yeah.
Anyway, no one wants to hear about our fantasy teams. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the world, more specifically the fantasy football world, I guess, in the primary read.
This is the primary read.
All right, let's get things started. Matt Hasselbeck re-aggravated his injury, and now he has what's being described as a nagging calf injury. Jake Locker came in and performed quite impressively.
Camed in?
Quite.
You thought you were gonna let me. You thought you were gonna get away with that, but
I did.
He didn't camed in. He came in.
Thought I could run past you on that one. But now it sounds like Jake Locker could be the starter for next week. This really doesn't matter too much. No one's starting Matt Hasselbeck or Jake Locker if they're still in the playoffs. But for those of you who are playing fun games with Damian Williams and Nate Washington, I think that Locker has the potential to really boost Damian Williams' value.
And if you are in a very deep league or 2-quarterback league, Jake Locker, he probably will start next week while Hasselbeck deals with that calf injury. I have Locker in the waiver wire segment because he did pass for 282 yards with a touchdown, and he rushed for 36 yards and an additional rushing touchdown. So he looked pretty good. I mean, he almost beat the New Orleans Saints.
Yeah.
It's really down to the very last play. They almost came back and beat the Saints. Pretty wild.
Yeah, and probably the biggest news was Greg Jennings, who injured his knee, will be out the next 2 to 3 weeks. The Packers say that they're hoping to have him back for the playoffs, but with a first-round bye all locked up, I don't imagine them rushing to get Jennings back until he's at 100%, which means Jennings is out for the playoff.
The fantasy playoffs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, does this do anything to Aaron Rodgers' value?
I'm not so down on Rodgers. I think a lot of people are worried that he's losing his favorite target, but the same thing happened last season when he lost Jermichael Finley, when Jermichael Finley was his hot target, and then that's when Greg Jennings really stepped it up and became the WR1 people drafted him to be. But with how many weapons Aaron Rodgers has, I think that his value is still going to be elite, and the people who are going to benefit from this are going to be James Jones and Jermichael Finley.
And potentially Donald Driver. First, I agree. I'm not worried about Aaron Rodgers. If anything, I'm not worried about who he's going to throw the ball to. There's plenty of weapons. I'm a little worried that maybe this will scare the Packers offense into thinking, maybe we should rest our starters. Once we have nothing to play for, we don't want to risk another injury like we just had to one of our key players. Was it 2 years ago that Wes Welker got injured when the Patriots had nothing to play for and Belichick was just doing his thing, stomping on defenses? And that kind of taught him a lesson that you shouldn't play your starters when you have nothing to play for, because then they lost Welker for the postseason, which sucked for them. But I would add James Jones and or Donald Driver, both available in the majority of leagues. Well, James Jones in just half leagues. Donald Driver had 4 catches for 75 yards in this game, and James Jones had just 2 catches for 29 yards. So neither spectacular. Of course, Driver had the better day, but I think I like James Jones a little bit more because he's been more productive on the season. I think he's technically going to step in and take take Greg Jennings' routes, and he's just younger and I think has more upside than Driver at this point. But both are worth ads, especially in deeper leagues, if you could use some wide receiver help.
Yeah, finally, and what was so disheartening for me, because I have him in every league and really needed a big performance out of him last night, DeMarco Murray has a season-ending ankle injury, which he suffered in the first quarter last night, which means that Felix Jones, once again, has his starting job back. So if any of you hung on to Felix Jones after we were so hot on him during the preseason.
And that's what I always said. I said Felix Jones is going to be a hot commodity this year. I never said when.
Yeah.
It might be week 15.
Yeah, so Felix Jones has looked very impressive in his limited performances last night, and I have high expectations for what he'll be able to do down the playoff run.
We will see. Can you just had the page open. We see his schedule coming up for the next 2 or 3 weeks. We'll see who Felix Jones will get the pleasure of feasting on. Corey's having some technical difficulties. He's a computer. Stop all the downloading.
Too much porn on my computer. He will have Tampa Bay and Philly, and then the Giants again week 17 if you're in one of those goofy leagues that goes all the way to week 17 in the playoffs.
So Tampa Bay is an excellent matchup right there. They've been horrible since they lost Gerald McCoy. So you'll definitely want to consider starting Felix this week.
Absolutely. And that wraps it up for our...
Okay. Well, moving on to where we tell you who to add as your Week 15 semifinals fantasy football championship team may still be in flux. We're going to help you work that waiver.
Working the waiver.
Work it.
Twerk it. Work it. The top ad has got to be Felix Jones, as we mentioned. My next ad is James Jones, and then Donald Driver, who we also mentioned. Next, got to work on my transitions. Furthermore, Keeland Williams is available in 97% of leagues. He had 12 carries for 43 yards and added 2 catches for 17 yards as Kevin Smith was inactive, unfortunately, and he's had such nagging injuries that I don't have a whole lot of hope that he'll be able to come back at full force. And Maurice Morris had a chest injury in this game. Morris was able to return to the game and saw a few more carries, which bodes well for his chances of returning. But again, if you're in deeper leagues, assuming Kevin Smith doesn't play next week, and there's the chance that Maurice Morris doesn't play next week, Keelan Williams would have the pleasure of facing Corey's Oakland Raiders, who made even Ryan Grant look like a stud. So Keelan Williams would be a great start next week if he gets that job. By attrition, of course. It's not like he has to prove anything. It's just a matter of injuries. We talked about Jake Locker. Rex Grossman, people have been adding him. He was a hot kind of spot start against the Patriots, and he pulled through. He had a nice fantasy game. You probably were pissed off to see one of the passing touchdowns on a trick play by Brandon Banks, I think, passed it to Santana Moss. But Rex Grossman does have 2 nice opponents in weeks 15 and 16 in the Giants and then Minnesota, especially for that championship game against Minnesota. Garbage time is Rex time.
Yeah, I mean, the Minnesota secondary is so diminished, and they're short. And so he'll have a nice matchup just being able to throw on them all day long.
Another guy we mentioned last week, but just to remind you, Demaryius Thomas. He had a great game last week. Most people thought it was a fluke, and he followed it up with another good game. 7 catches for 78 yards and a touchdown. Tim Tebow, what is there to say about that guy? He's horrible in 3 quarters, and then so good in the 4th quarter. And Demaryius Thomas was one of his go-to guys that made it happen in that 4th quarter. So this is 2 weeks in a row. It's hard to ignore. If you're in a situation, which I can't imagine that you are in the playoffs, but if you have that 3rd wide receiver spot and have to decide between Demaryius Thomas and Eric Decker this week, it's a hard decision.
Yeah. I agree. I mean...
You agree? You have a thought on who you'd start?
Well, I prefer Demaryius Thomas just because he's currently the hot hand.
Uh-huh.
But,
his hands are really hot, actually. I've seen them. They're like the plastics of hands.
Yeah, as we've seen all season, this has been a very hard to predict year, both actually in the NFL and also in fantasy. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's some random no-name who steps up next week, because honestly, defenses are at some point going to figure out how to key in on Tim Tebow.
Well, everyone said it would be the Bears, and they did a pretty good job through 3 quarters, but so is everyone. So it really came down to that 4th quarter where they let him win the game. Well, and it was really Matt Prater, who won the game with two 50-plus yard field goals. That's pretty clutch. But
And Marion the Barbarian stepping out of bounds, which gave the Broncos enough time to come back to tie it.
True.
And his fumble that gave the Broncos the ball in overtime to set up another Matt Willis Prater field goal.
it's always hard. I feel like players get the blame or the credit for whatever they did last. Most recently, it's like, oh, he cost them the game. Well, he also, Marion Barber, that is, like, gave them the opportunity to win the game by scoring that touchdown by running the ball so effectively throughout it. Maybe the argument is that he shouldn't have fumbled, and if he hadn't ran it in, any other running back could have. But sometimes it's unfair, It's like that Stevie Johnson thing. They say he cost them the game. Well, he also had a great game. Maybe they would have lost by even more if he, didn't play at all. Anyway, you don't care. You're just watching your Rams defense get crushed on the TV screen here.
That is correct.
The last time we did the podcast during the game was that Jets game where there's actually more going on, more to react to. But this game is just so sucky. The audience doesn't even know that our eyes are both glued to the big screen TV right in front of us. Finally, Titus Young. He's kind of alternating good games with Nate Burleson as Calvin Johnson continues to see double, triple, quadruple coverage, octuple coverage, leaving Titus Young or Nate Burleson free to benefit. And Titus Young has put together some pretty decent games over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And this week he saw 4 catches for 87 yards and the touchdown and led the team in targets.